Thank you, Stephen. Hi, okay, so I'm Len. The title of my talk today is Selfless Leadership. So why three separate words? I'll explain that in a second. My thesis for the talk is that selfless leadership is actually a better way to lead people through organizational change, and probably more important, at the end of the day, it feels better too. So I'm going to do this in a series of questions. And first, let's look at just a personal example. A question: when were you at your best? So I'm going to give credit to Jen Villalobos, who I know I saw here earlier. Yes, who recently graduated and just got a job here as a faculty member. Congratulations, Jen. So every year before the school year starts, I like to do a leadership retreat, and I like to get people to help me with the leadership retreat. So this past September, I asked Jen to help me. We worked on the whole agenda for the retreat. She came up with the icebreaker exercise, and it was that question that we asked each of the leadership team members. What was a moment when you're at your best, living your best self? Could be personal, could be professional. Mine was a moment at what my family refers to affectionately as the Mountain House, and that's a picture of the Mountain House and one of the many dinners there with my family. There was a night, though, a bit before that night that you're seeing behind me that was not quite as joyous as that night. That's my son, drama in the front, and then my daughter's the head off on the side, kind of going sideways. A few years before that, when they were much younger, I had a pretty somber night at the Mountain House that night. And it's odd that I would think of it as sort of a moment when I thought that I was at my best, because it was a moment when I was at my worst. I was probably at the lowest low point, certainly of my adult life. I had just recently come off of a very difficult divorce. And I was sitting at the house one night there in the dining room, a lot like that. I gotten the kids off to bed, and they were in the rooms just off the hallway. They're sleeping safely in bed. And I got a little glass of Cabernet out, and I was literally crying into my Cabernet, my salty Cabernet that night, and looking out the window through the pine trees kind of down in town, the twinkling lights. And it was a pretty poignant moment for me, because think of all the emotions. I'm just coming off a difficult divorce, and I've got a whole gamut of emotions around that, including grief and a bunch of other things. And then I'm now faced with, having been a dean at the time, becoming a vice president, with my kids with me for half the week. How am I going to do that? I'm not kidding you, abject fear about how was I going to now be a dad for half of the time, trying to also be a busy executive. I had no idea how I was going to do that. And sandwiched kind of in between those emotions in the middle was the worst of all that night, especially feeling a sense of deep, deep loneliness, bordering on despair. It was not a good moment, not a good look for me, crying into my wine. But the reason I thought of it, Jen, when we did that exercise was because I had to make a shift. I had no choice. And so I was forced from from being relatively selfish to being more selfless. And I wasn't not like I was a bad person, but it was all me, and it was about my career, and everything in our family was structured around what I was doing. And that was done. I had no choice but to then move into now trying to find a bit more balance in my life and becoming a better father, from selfish to selfless. So there's a personal example. Now let's put it into a work setting, a work example. This is a scene at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Go Rebels. It's a beautiful little rose garden. And the question that goes along with this one is, what does it mean to selfless? So selfless, just really quick, selfless is a state of mind, thinking more about others. But to actually selfless, think of the word self as a verb. I need to selfless, like wag more, bark less. And I'm trying to make the argument that you need to selfless, not only in personal life, gave you an example, now in a work setting. So I use the UNLV picture because when I became president there, I did as a good president does, and you do your first 100 days as a listening tour, and you're talking to all the different stakeholder groups, both on campus and off. I met with the groundskeeping crew that took care of that rose garden and many other beautiful spots on campus. And after we were done, one of the groundskeeping supervisors, Conrad, asked if he could come later to my office to talk to me privately. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder why he wants to do that. And then anyway, so we have a conversation in my office later, and think about the courage it took for him to come and talk with me about this. And he said, you know, we have this really generous tuition benefit for employees at this university, which I did know about, that basically employees, their kids get to go to UNLV practically for free. It's a huge deal, really good deal. And he said, it extends to the faculty, yes, and it also extends to the administrators like yourself, yes. It extends to the professional staff, but it is not extended to the classified staff like Conrad, groundskeepers and bookkeepers, the people you could argue at the university who needed that tuition benefit for their family the most because they couldn't afford to send their kids to UNLV. And so it took a lot of hard work, but we eventually got the tuition benefit extended to the classified staff. I give credit to Conrad for being the one that brought it up and being the one that really pushed it through, including him, talk about courage, going to Regents meetings in the kind of open mic, meeting after meeting after meeting and just hammering this home with our board. And I think almost single-handedly got that done. What I use that as a work example of what I'm trying to talk about because the epiphany for me was we were working on all these big projects, building a stadium and doing a medical school. We wanted to get to Carnegie R1, maybe get to a Power 5 conference, and I had all these lofty plans. But as I look back, it was things like the extension of the tuition benefit that I'm the most proud of because that's where we were having real impact on people. It was an opportunity for us to be in service to people who really needed it, not just thinking selflessly, but actually acting in service to others and doing things for them that really counted. In this case, think of the transformational effect on families over generations by being able to have that benefit. Okay, so now let's do a quick example showing how that selfless leadership could be of practical benefit in trying to get stuff done inside an organization. Anybody that's found themselves in a leadership role, especially if you're trying to get stuff done, like you really want to move the needle on big important things, you know that you're going to run into organizational resistance to change. Sometimes it's out in the open, a little bit easier to deal with. Sometimes it's not so easy to see. It's passive aggressive and it's kind of a little harder to spot and to deal with. This was sometime before UNLV, back at my alma mater, the University of Arizona, and I found myself back as the dean of the Eller College of Management in McClellan Hall. I did my listening tour and talking to everybody, and we determined that MBA enrollments were going down at the time as they were around the country, and we needed to replace that with something. The school needed the revenues from it. And so it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that we needed to do an online MBA to kind of replace the enrollments from the on-ground MBA that were going down. But we had a group of senior faculty that were resisting the change, and it wasn't clear really kind of what it was about and why there was resistance. So we had meetings with the senior group of faculty, and the stuff we talked about was sort of all up at the 30,000 foot level, and there were these kind of intellectual arguments about, boy, with an MBA, we're really training leaders, we're creating leaders, and that modality of teaching online, the modality doesn't fit the pedagogy and the curriculum goals, and we were kind of going round and round and round with these arguments up here. And then we started to look around the country, and there were already programs at the time that were going to online, and they were having great outcomes, and they were still training leaders, and they were doing all the stuff that we were kind of talking about not being possible. So it was obvious that those weren't really the real reasons. And it was hard to figure out and to kind of glean from the faculty what it was that was really bothering them. And our associate dean at the time, Jeff, suggested, we really need to get outside of the environment. Let's take a few of these faculty out. We might have gone to a bar and it might have been over beers, but we got them off campus to have conversation with them to try to learn the real reasons for what was bothering them, to kind of take the barriers down. And it was kind of through that mechanism that we learned that the real reason was that they were later in their career, and it was a lot of work to change the way they were teaching these on-ground courses to teaching now in the new environment, a learning management system in an online course. And we're having these conversations with them, and the epiphany there was that both Jeff and I realized that we actually agreed with them. Those were legitimate reasons. That was a lot of work. And for them at this stage of their career, it was even more difficult because they kind of were so well trained, in the methods they'd used before. This was completely new. And God, it would take so long for them that with the time they had remaining was at the best use of their time. We got it. We empathized with them. It was difficult, though, because we were hard charging. We had an agenda. We have our own egos. We want to get this stuff launched and get it done because we got other stuff we want to move on to. But we had to kind of take ourselves out of the equation for a moment and sit down with them, number one, actually listen to them, actually empathize. We found out that we actually agreed with them, And it changed the conversation, because then the conversation became, all right, you're making a good point. Can we agree that we need to have an online MBA because we're going to need the enrollments and the revenue? Yes, we all agree. How about if we let this group of champions over here who really want to build the online MBA go do that, and then you all keep teaching the stuff you're teaching, the way you're teaching it, you do a really good job with it, and finish out that way, but just promise that you won't do the passive-aggressive stuff and sabotage or delay the project over here, because we need it to actually succeed. And we got agreement on that. We built the program. It's now got hundreds of students in it, and it's bringing in much needed revenue for that business school. So we got to where we needed. We needed to take ourselves out and become a bit more selfless and empathize, and that helped us get around the barriers and work out a great solution. When I talk about this point, sort of using selfless leadership as a way to actually lead people through organizational change better, I often get back from leaders that, God, doesn't that slow you down? But what I like to say is, man, go slow to go fast, because ultimately that resistance is still going to be there and it's still going to get in your way. All right, so next one. Let's take this up to a 30,000-foot level and make it a little bit broader. How about this question? How do you spend your time? I'm struck by a quote by Neil Armstrong, astronaut, and he was in an interview, and I won't tell you the context, it doesn't matter, but an answer he had to a question, I think it was about his workout regimen or something, but his answer was important beyond his exercise scheme. And he said, you know, each one of us is on this earth with a finite number of beats in our heart. And then he had some, you know, kind of pithy response, and I'll be damned if I'm going to waste them doing whatever it was, jogging or whatever the question was. But I took a more fundamental meaning out of that. You know, finite number of beats in our heart while we're on the earth, and, you know, don't waste it. So then it got me thinking about the people that I work with, and I realized that if you think about it, in a 24-hour day cycle, if you take out the hours at night when we're sleeping, now you're down to the waking hours in a day, and that most of us, most normal people, you're working. Most of those waking hours are spent working, a good portion of it. And then if you extrapolate that over a life, most of us, right, at an early age, we start working, and we work a life, and we retire. Many of us go too late, and we retire, and then we have a few years left before we pass. So it's this big swath of life that's spent working, and then, you know, you take it down to a 24-hour day in a cycle, big chunk of the day working. I came to this sad realization that the people that I was working with are spending an inordinate sort of proportion of their lives with me working, kind of toiling away working. But the realization that I came away from that is that isn't it then our duty as a leader to make sure that that time is time well spent? Like, wouldn't it, at a simple level, wouldn't it be important to you as a leader to make sure that people, even just once in a while, find a little joy and happiness at work? Maybe that people would laugh at work once in a while? And then at a broader level, wouldn't it also be our responsibility, kind of deeper, broader level, to help people we work with to derive meaning and fulfillment from their work? So when they get to the end of the path, they know, yeah, it was time well spent. They did good. They did good for people. In fact, I think that's probably the primary responsibility of leaders, is to ensure that the people we're working with are deriving meaning and fulfillment from the work that they do, and not meaningful to the organization. I mean meaningful to them personally. So I think that perhaps is the greatest responsibility that leaders have, and talk about selfless leadership. Okay, one more to end with, just a little finisher, bonus point. A little bit of Italian. I'm Italian, so ancora imparo. I am still learning. In Italian, the translation is probably closer to yet I am learning. Thought to be said by Michelangelo at 87 years old. He's working on St. Peter's Basilica, Sistine Chapel. Was he laying on his back or was he standing upright? Historians are arguing, and we're all still wondering if he actually said this. I think he did. I'm Italian. I think he did. I think he would have said this. And the notion was, I mean, look what I'm doing and what I'm involved in, and yet I'm still learning every day. The point that I'm trying to make here is that I think if you're really doing selfless leadership right, it's important to not think of yourself as a leader, but rather as a student of leadership. Not a leader, a student of leadership, because you're continually learning, continually evolving, continually growing in the process. What better selfless way to think about yourself as a leader than to think, you know what, I'm a work in process. So my advice here is get over it. Surround yourself by people smarter than you and get over it, and just keep working at it. Keep grinding every day. Okay, my thesis revisited, selfless, scratch that, selfless, self is a verb, selfless leadership, a better way to lead people through change. At the end of the day, it's going to feel better. And trust me, when you get to the end of your path, you're going to, in that moment, you're going to want to know. You're going to want to look back and know over your life, over your path, that you did as much as you could to do as much good as you could for as many people as you could have, and that you never shied away from an opportunity to do so. Selfless leadership. Thank you.